Hey guys, so this is a continuation, chapter 28. So we saw the 1968 was a tumultuous year for the United States of America. The Democratic Convention was going on during the summer. Unfortunately, they did not have any good Democrat candidates running for office. So in November 1968, Richard Nixon, a Republican, is elected president. So we're going to look at Richard Nixon in the Vietnam War. Like Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon believed that abandoning Vietnam would harm U.S. credibility. But by that point in 1968, U.S. credibility had been damaged and ruined. So Nixon calls for peace with honor. In other words, he wants to start to withdraw troops from Vietnam so that they could be honorably peaceful. However, North Vietnam wanted to control the entire country as a unified country under communist rule. So Nixon in 1968 calls for Vietnamization. Basically, all this is Southern Vietnamese are doing most of the fighting and the intense fighting where the United States takes a back seat. So Nixon begins to withdraw troops in 1968. I'll show you a chart that shows you some of these numbers as well. However, even as he begins to withdraw troops, we have a horrible incident in April 30th, 1970, where U.S. troops destroyed North Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. Now, this is important because Cambodia had nothing to do with the war. They were actually a neutral country. When word gets out that the United States invaded Cambodia, it launches mass protests across the United States. College students take to their campus plaza and they began to protest. And we have a horrible incident that takes place on May 1970. College students at Kent State University began to protest, and apparently they started to harass some of the National Guards in the National Guard office. So the National Guards opened fires, killing 4 of these college students and wounding 11 as well. And when word gets out that the National Guard killed 4 college students, we have even more protests because now casualties are not limited to Vietnam. Over the Vietnam War, casualties are also being done here at home over the Vietnam War. So this pressure to continue to withdraw from Vietnam mountains on Richard Nixon. So this is the chart that I was going to show you. Notice in 1960, when John F. Kennedy takes office, very few troops were deployed to Vietnam. In 1964, recall that is when Lyndon B. Johnson promised that he was not going to send American boys to go fight in Vietnam, and that is why he gets reelected. The following year, in 1968, we start seeing the increase of deployment to Vietnam, and by 1968, when Lyndon B. Johnson decides that he's no longer going to run for president, that is when we have most troops in Vietnam than ever, over 500,000 troops. In 1969, when Nixon takes office, he begins to de-escalate this form of Vietnamization from Vietnam. And by the time he leaves office, a lot of the troops are out of Vietnam. You could read this caption here that tells you a little bit more of the numbers and what was going on in the Vietnam War as well, and the amount of troops that were being deployed from there. So let's look at this chart here. That's South Saigon, and that's the capital of South Vietnam. This is North Vietnam over here, and that is Cambodia. So the United States started to, you notice this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so some Northern Vietnamese were using it to send some of the goods and some of the equipment that they needed. While the United States starts to infiltrate into Cambodia from South Vietnam, invading a neutral country, and it is because of this that students lead to the protests, and the Kent State shooting happens in 1970, killing 4 college students as well. But again, the United States was pretty much on the retreat at this point. So this is the road to the fall of Saigon. In 1968, again, the tumultuous year in the United States, we have the My Lai massacre. My Lai is a small town in Vietnam, and U.S. troops went in there, killing 500 civilians, women, and children as well. When word gets out of that massacre and how U.S. troops, U.S. children were killing civilians, there's even more protests over the Vietnam War, and again, pressure continues to mount. When Nixon takes office, he has this idea of détente, which is pretty similar, lessening tensions. Now, we also have the Strategic Arm Limitations Treaty. I forgot the T there. The Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty, which becomes known as SALT I. So this is a treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. Remember, we are still fighting the Cold War. So the Soviet Union and the United States agree that they're going to start to limit the amount of weapons that they have over the issue of Vietnam War. In 1972, we have a major breakthrough. Nixon visited China, a communist country, and the Soviet Union, another communist country. So for the first time in U.S. history ever, a president visits a communist country in China and the Soviet Union. Now, the reason Nixon does that is he was hoping to play one of these nations against the other, and also to push for these two communist nations to refrain from aiding North Vietnam. By word, they both agreed that they were going to stop aiding North Vietnam, but in reality, they didn't. They continued to supply weapons and money to the North Vietnamese. However, it thus starts to kind of, to a certain extent, strengthen relationships between the United States and China more than anything economically. Not so much with Soviet Union. And this is what happens. So we see Northern Vietnamese troops on the left-hand side here. They are manning a Soviet Union tank, and they're using it to break into, I believe this is the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Saigon. Remember, Saigon is the capital of South Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese, by taking the U.S. embassy and by taking South Vietnam, in essence, that is their march to victory. So on April 30th, 1975, we see here also the U.S. embassy, helicopters. They are airing out civilians from the South Vietnam. They're airing out any more of the U.S. embassy personnel there. And that is a picture that pretty much depicts the fall of Saigon and how the United States lost Saigon in South Vietnam. And now Vietnam is united as a communist country with the North in charge. So we have China, who is a communist country, the Soviet Union, who is a communist country, and now Vietnam, who is a communist country. So containment policy was not very successful in China and in Vietnam, and of course also in other countries like Cuba. So because of all these things, all these issues going on, we have a new group of people that become known as the New Left. In terms of politics, when we talk about the left, it usually refers to liberals, people who are ready for change and equality. When it refers to the right, these are conservative traditionalists who try to keep things the way they are. So this New Left is a group of people who are liberals, reformers, seeking equality, and protesting certain government policies. In 1964, part of the New Left includes college students from the University of California, Berkeley. And what happens here is that the administration, they began to ban political activities in the school's plaza. And so to retaliate against that, college students launched these free speech demonstrations, and they stage a protest in the college. And so we see this free speech movement that college students launch, and this accelerates again the protests against the government, against Vietnam, and against other policies. And in 1967, things don't get any better. The selective service system abolished the student deferment for military service. Before 1967, if you were a college student, you were dismissed from serving in the military. But in 1967, the United States Armed Forces says that being a college student no longer excuses you from serving in the armed forces. So again, that intensifies the anti-war movement. Draftees burned their draft cards. A major figure was Muhammad Ali. He was drafted to go to the war, and he burned his draft card, and as such, he was banned from fighting in the United States. So he is forced to fight abroad, and some of his titles were also taken away from him. Tens of thousands of people continue to protest the war and government policies. Part of the New Left group are the gays in 1969 and what becomes known as the Gay Liberation. Before the 1969, the Stone Inn riot, police forces in New York were raiding bars, were raiding locations where gays would congregate and civilize. So in this Stonewall Inn, the police force enter and they start to arrest and beat gays. Well, at this time, gays had had enough and they start to fight back. Again, this idea of fighting against authority. We see it everywhere. In this particular case, again, sexual rights and the anti-war movement against the war. And we see also women's movement and, of course, the civil rights movement as well. But this is all started because of the civil rights movement as well, right? So we see a lot of protests going on. And of course, we can't talk about the 60s without the counterculture. So the counterculture is young Americans against authority, again, in particular government, but it does extend to other forms of life, like teaching and parents. We have this idea and identity of hippies and how they are dressed. And also, What becomes known as flower children is a group of children who are dropouts, drifters, and runaway teenagers just trying to find their identity. Now, we do have radicals within the counterculture, and radicals preach liberation through sex, drugs, music, and personal transformation. So this was more of a counterculture against cultural norms and against restraining. So they wanted to identify themselves as this new form of identity based on social norms, not necessarily on political norms, which is what we've been talking about in the previous slides for the most part. And Woodstock in 1969, you could see again this caption here, was the defining moment of the counterculture revolution, where they staged a 3-day concert outdoors, and they kind of, just go and do whatever they feel was right in liberation of social norms, traditional social norms. Finally, the Warren Court. So Errol Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He begins to advocate for civil rights. Now, this is important because he becomes known, the Warren Court takes place from 1954 to 1969. During this time, again, few presidents had had the courage to actually take civil rights cases. And Errol Warren says, if the president doesn't take it as in his hand, then I'm going to make civil rights my issue. So he rules over major cases like Brown versus Board of Education and Miranda versus Arizona. In Miranda versus Arizona, if a police agent arrests you, that police agent is required to reach you your rights. And a lot of people begin to protest that. And it kind of goes with this point over here, where even those who are arrested but don't have money to have a lawyer, they have a constitutional right to a lawyer. So people begin to kind of blame Warren Court for some of the social unrest that was going on. And also he eliminates prayer and Bible reading in public schools led by teachers. Students could still do it as a club, but he banned prayer and Bible reading in public schools led by teachers. And what we see here in the 1960s and 1970s, an increase in crime. Now, a lot of people, again, began to blame the Warren Court because of what he did, eliminating Bible, having criminals have their rights being read and right to legal counsel. But there were other factors involved, drugs, income inequality, and guns as well. When Nixon came into office, he said that he was going to establish law and order. But by 1970, people started to question, where is this law and order? And so with all these movements, with all these liberal lefts going on, by the time Nixon leaves office, and we'll talk a little bit about him more, people were kind of tired of all this anti-war movement, all this protest, and they were ready for a new conservative movement as well. So just as a recap of this chapter, we're going to look at a couple of things. So if you recall, we started with LBJ and his Great Society. He talks about the war on poverty as well. And this chart kind of tells us how poverty rates did drop when LBJ takes office. You see it here, in particular during this time. This is when the Vietnam War escalates. So as the Vietnam War escalates, poverty rates go down because people are finding jobs in defense industry. So we have a huge military budget, and that's why it drops. But also, Great Society, social programs to help social problems, and that is part of the reason why poverty decreases as well. But LBJ is spending a lot of money on the Great Society, trying to help poverty, and he's spending a lot of money on the war in Vietnam. So eventually he doesn't have enough money to fund both of them. So the Great Society begins to take a back seat. Remember, LBJ, he was a teacher. That is the school that he went into. And on the opposite side of where I'm standing, it is this same spot where he signed the education bill, where he gave more rights for preschool kids who were poor and for college students, with the federal government was going to aid them in terms of scholarships as well. 1960s, we also saw now National Organization for Women, and women who are now trying to call for more equality and more rights. On the right hand side here, we had Betty Friedan. Remember, she was the one that wrote the Feminine Mystique, which was targeted at young college educated women who began to call for rights now, women's rights now. National Organization of Women as well. Robert Kennedy. So in 1968, when Lyndon B. Johnson was falling out of popularity and the Democratic Convention was going on, Robert Kennedy becomes a leading Democratic candidate for president. However, just like Martin Luther King is assassinated on April 1968, 2 months later, 3 weeks after this photo was taken, Robert Kennedy is also assassinated. And because of this is what gives Richard Nixon the victory. Many people believe that if Robert Kennedy would have stayed alive, he would have become president. And finally, we also see the continued protests of the war in Vietnam. So again, Saigon is the capital of South Vietnam. And what is the United States doing? Pulling the strings, in essence, showing that they are in control. And this is U.S. imperialism. And people begin to call for U.S. withdrawal of Vietnam because we had no business going into Vietnam. And at the end of it, North Vietnam eventually won, and Vietnam became a communist country anyways.